Hi, I am Sophia. Welcome to True Payback, where story hits different. Hit subscribe. Let's dive in.
The restaurant was called Ardent, and it had been impossible to get a reservation there for approximately 3 years, which meant that when my cousin Priya secured the private dining room on the second floor for her pre-IPO celebration dinner, she mentioned it to everyone within conversational range at least twice. The room, the restaurant, the guest list. These things mattered to Priya. They always had. They were evidence of something. I had spent most of my adult life trying to understand exactly what they were evidence of, and I had come finally to a clean conclusion. They were evidence of how afraid she was that they might not be true. I arrived at Ardent at 7:15 on a Thursday in March, which was 11 minutes after the dinner was scheduled to begin, which was intentional. I had learned, over many years of navigating spaces where I was tolerated rather than welcomed, that arriving slightly late was better than arriving on time, because arriving on time meant standing near the door while the room organized itself around hierarchies you hadn't been assigned a role in. Arriving slightly late meant walking into a room that was already in motion, which required less navigation. The private dining room was warm and cream-colored and full. 12 people around a long table, 4 of whom I recognized as investors, 2 of whom were Priya's lawyers, 1 of whom was her husband Derek, and the rest of whom were the kind of peripheral attendees that gather around financial events the way birds gather around fresh-turned earth. Not sure exactly what's being unearthed, but certain it will be worth something. Priya saw me from across the room and smiled the way she always smiled at me, wide, brief, slightly surprised, as if she had half expected I wouldn't show. She was wearing a green silk dress and her hair was down, and she was genuinely beautiful in the way that certain people are beautiful when they are at the center of something they have wanted for a very long time. I recognized the glow. I understood it. I had felt it myself quietly in rooms where no one was watching. "Rhea," she said, air-kissing my cheek. "You made it." "I made it," I confirmed. She steered me toward a seat at the far end of the table. Not the far end in the dismissive sense, I want to be precise, but the far end in the this is where the people who are as courtesy rather than necessity sit sense. I had been assigned to that end of tables my entire life. I sat down. I adjusted my napkin. I smiled at the man to my left, who turned out to be the VP of operations at one of Priya's supplier companies, and who spent the first 20 minutes telling me about his daughter's lacrosse tournament in a way that I found genuinely pleasant. The dinner moved in the way these dinners move. Wine, then bread, then the particular social rhythm of people performing confidence for each other. Priya held the room well. He always had. She was precise with numbers when she needed to be and warm with personality when that was called for, and she had built her company, Luminary Health Technologies, a mid-sized health data analytics firm based in Chicago, through a combination of genuine product vision and the specific social intelligence of someone who understood that business at a certain level was mostly about making people feel that they were in the right room. She had built it from something I'd had a hand in creating. That was the part she didn't mention. Let me go back because the shape of this story requires it. My Aunt Sunita, Priya's mother, my mother's older sister, came to the United States from Ahmedabad in 1987, married my uncle Vikram, and built a mid-sized healthcare staffing company in Chicago called Meridian Medical Staffing over the following 20 years. He was, by every account, formidable. She was also, by my account, one of the primary architects of the particular family dynamic that had shaped both Priya and me, just in entirely different directions. Priya was the daughter. She was trained from childhood in the company. She attended board meetings at 15. She understood the business language of the industry before she understood algebra. She was, in the family cosmology, the inheritor. I was the niece. I visited on holidays. I was smart. Everyone in the family agreed I was smart, but smart in the way that gets described as academic or theoretical, which are the words families use for intelligence they don't know what to do with. My father had not built anything. He was a high school chemistry teacher in suburban Cleveland, which was respectable and unremarkable and which placed me in the family's implicit hierarchy, at a meaningful distance from the people who made real decisions about real money. Here is what the family did not know. When Priya started Luminary Health Technologies in 2018, she came to me first. Not to ask my opinion. Not to involve me. He came to me with a specific problem. She was 6 months from launch, she had 2 term sheets from venture funds that she didn't love, and she had a structural problem in her go-to-market model that she couldn't solve. She had heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that I had spent the previous 4 years at a health technology strategy consultancy in New York, and that I had specifically worked on data architecture models for mid-market health analytics platforms. She was pragmatic. When Priya needed something, she found it. It was one of her genuine strengths, and I respected it even then. We met for coffee in Chicago on a Saturday in January 2018. She laid out the problem. It was a real one. Her customer acquisition model assumed hospital system integration that her platform architecture couldn't actually support at the data transfer layer. She had been told it was fine by 2 different technical advisors, and she didn't believe them. She was right not to believe them. I spent 3 weeks analyzing the architecture. I produced a 40-page restructuring proposal. I solved the problem. And then Priya, who was grateful and practical and who had the specific unsentimental quality of someone who has learned to separate personal relationships from professional transactions, made me an offer. "I can't pay you consulting rates right now," she said. "But I can give you equity. Real equity. I'm thinking 3%. I looked at her across the table. "The restructuring I just did for you," I said, "is the reason your platform can support institutional clients. Without it, your entire enterprise tier doesn't exist. 3% doesn't reflect that." She was quiet. "I want 30%, I said. "And a first right of refusal on any future funding rounds that would dilute below majority." She almost said no. I watched her almost say no. Then I watched her run the calculation, the same calculation she ran on everything, and the calculation came out in my favor. 25, she said. 28, I said. We settled at 26. Over the next 4 years, through 2 additional funding rounds in which I exercised my right of refusal and increased my position both times, my stake had grown to 67%. Priya knew this. She had always known this. It was in the shareholder agreement, properly documented, reviewed by both our attorneys. What changed over time was not the legal reality but the story she told about it, to her investors, to her board, to herself. The story evolved gradually from "my co-founder and structural architect holds majority shares," to "an early strategic partner holds a significant minority position," to "at some point I couldn't precisely identify," something closer to "I have a silent investor who isn't really involved." I watched this happen. I didn't correct it. I was building my own career. By 2021 I had moved back to New York and was running the health technology practice at a mid-sized PE firm. And Luminary was one of 8 portfolio positions I managed, and the company was performing well, and I saw no reason to insert myself into Priya's public narrative as long as the business was sound. The business was sound. Until the IPO. Here is the problem with taking a privately held company with a complex shareholder structure public. The underwriters have to tell the truth. Priya's investment bankers at Harwick and Lane had spent 4 months preparing the S-1 filing. Somewhere in that process, someone on their team had pulled the full shareholder registry and discovered that the majority position, 67% of all voting shares, was held not by the founder but by a woman named Rhea Mehta, whose current occupation was listed as Managing Director, Apex Health Capital, New York. I knew about this discovery because James Okafor, my attorney, had received 3 calls from Harwick and Lane's counsel in the week following the discovery. The calls had a specific quality. The quality of people who have found something they don't understand and need to understand quickly. I had James explain it to them. Clearly and completely. The original equity agreement, the 2 subsequent dilution rights exercises, the current ownership structure. Everything. They had then, presumably, explained it to Priya. What happened next is what brought me to Ardent, to the far end of the table, adjusting my napkin. I knew, walking into that dinner, that Priya had not told her investors the full picture. I knew this because James had told me that Harwick and Lane's counsel had advised Priya to disclose the ownership structure to her investor group before the IPO, and that Priya had indicated she planned to manage the communication carefully, which is what people say when they plan to delay the communication until it is no longer avoidable. The dinner was the delay. 11 investors in that room, toasting Priya's vision and Priya's leadership and Priya's 5-year journey from concept to public offering. And not one of them knew that the majority of the company they were about to evaluate for public investment was owned by the quiet woman at the far end of the table. I ate my appetizer. I talked to the lacrosse father about the Mid-Atlantic regional rankings, which I knew nothing about but found surprisingly easy to navigate with the right questions. I drank water. I watched Priya hold the room with her particular combination of warmth and precision, and I felt something I didn't want to feel. Something close to admiration, unresolved, adjacent to grief. Because Priya was good at this. That was the honest thing. She was genuinely good at the human part of building a company, the part that is not architecture or data models or shareholder agreements but is, in some ways, more important, the ability to make people believe in something, to transmit vision, to hold a room. I was not good at that part. I was good at the part that makes the room worth holding. We had, in the beginning, been complementary. And then, gradually, the complementarity had been erased from the public record, and I had been moved to the far end of the table, and apparently that was the arrangement. The arrangement was about to change. My phone buzzed at 9:15. It was a text from James. Harwick and Lane received the formal shareholder disclosure filing 20 minutes ago. Per the agreement, they are required to notify their underwriting committee. You'll hear from them tomorrow. I put my phone back in my bag. Dessert arrived. Priya stood to give a toast, warm, personal, specific in a way that showed she had prepared it. She thanked her team. She thanked her investors. She described the journey. She said the word built 11 times, which I counted not vindicatively, but because counting things is a habit from years of analyzing data. She did not mention me. I was looking at my dessert fork when Derek, Priya's husband, leaned toward the investor to his right, a man named Garrett Ashby whose fund held a significant Series B position, and said conversationally, not bothering to lower his voice, "Honestly, watching Rhea try to talk business is painful." He said it the way people say things at tables when they have had enough wine to believe they are speaking quietly. Painful, Garrett agreed, glancing at me briefly with the polite non-expression of someone being included in a minor social categorization. I smiled silently. I adjusted my napkin. I thought, 2 more days. My firm was called Apex Health Capital and I ran the health technology practice, which meant I spent most of my working hours in a state of focused, detailed, relentless analytical engagement that I found genuinely sustaining. I was not, contrary to Derek's assessment, painful to watch discuss business. I was, if anything, too precise for social settings. I had been told this by people who liked me, which is the most trustworthy form of criticism. My colleague and closest work friend, a Nigerian-British woman named Adiz Obi who ran our diagnostics portfolio, had a running joke that I communicated in financial models the way other people communicated in facial expressions. Fluently, rapidly, in a medium that was perfectly clear to me and occasionally opaque to everyone else. It was not entirely unfair. Adiz was the person I called in February when I had first understood that the IPO process was going to force a disclosure I had never intended to weaponize. "You're not weaponizing it," she said. "You're exercising a legal right you've held for 6 years. I'm exercising it at a moment that will cause maximum disruption to someone I know personally." Did she cause you maximum disruption when she took credit for architecture you built and moved you to the category of silent investor in every conversation she had about her company? I was quiet. "The timing isn't a weapon," Adiz said. "The timing is the IPO process doing what IPO processes do. You didn't choose the timing. Harwick and Lane chose the timing when they pulled the shareholder registry." This was true. It was also true that I could have called Priya before the dinner, before the formal filing, before the underwriters got involved and said, "We need to talk about how this disclosure happens." I could have managed it quietly. Given her time to prepare her investors. Allowed the story to be told in a way that minimized the impact. I had chosen not to do that. I want to be honest about this. I had reviewed the options and I had made a decision, and the decision was to let the legal process proceed as it was designed to proceed. And I want to say that it was purely because it was the cleanest and most legally appropriate approach, but that would not be the whole truth. The whole truth included Derek saying painful to a table full of investors who were about to make decisions about a company I own the majority of. The whole truth included every holiday dinner where Priya had talked about her company with the particular pride of sole authorship, and I had sat in the equivalent of the far end of the table, smiling, adjusting my napkin. The whole truth was complicated. The decision still stood. I have a daughter. Her name is Zara. She is 7 years old and she lives primarily with her father, my ex-husband Ravi, in Brooklyn, 40 minutes from my apartment in Manhattan. We have a workable co-parenting arrangement that requires constant maintenance and produces, on its good days, a child who feels genuinely loved by both of her parents, and on its difficult days, a scheduling negotiation that can consume an entire afternoon. Zara was with me that weekend. The weekend after the IPO dinner, the weekend before the filing hit Priya's investors. We went to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden on Saturday, which Zara had requested because she was going through a phase of intense interest in carnivorous plants that I was fully committed to supporting. We spent 45 minutes in the greenhouse and she asked me, specifically and without any prompting, how a Venus flytrap knew when to close. It counts, I said. It has tiny hairs inside the trap. If you touch one hair, nothing happens. If you touch two hairs within about 20 seconds, it closes. Zara processed this with the particular intensity she brought to new information. So it waits, she said. It waits, I confirmed. One touch isn't enough. It needs two. She thought about this for a long time. Then she said, that's smart. So it doesn't waste energy closing on things that aren't really there. I looked at my daughter for a moment. She had moved on to examining a pitcher plant and was not looking at me. 7 years old. That's exactly right, I said. I thought about this later in ways I didn't entirely plan to. The call came on Monday morning at 8:47 a.m. I was at my desk at Apex, coffee cooling beside me when James texted, Harwick and Lane just escalated. Lead banker is calling Priya now. 6 minutes later my personal phone rang. It was Priya. I let it ring through. She called again. I let it ring through again. I was not avoiding her. I was in the middle of a genuine meeting and I had a policy about personal calls during client discussions that I maintained consistently, regardless of circumstances. She called a third time at 9:22 after my meeting had ended. I answered. Rhea. Her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Not anger exactly. Priya was too controlled for pure anger. Something more like the sound of a structure under load. The bank called me. They said you filed a formal shareholder disclosure. I did, I said. You didn't tell me you were going to do that. The shareholder agreement requires disclosure to underwriters when a majority holder's identity affects the offering prospectus, I said. Harwick and Lane's counsel requested the documentation. I provided it. This is standard procedure. You could have called me first. You could have disclosed the ownership structure to your investors before you started planning an IPO, I said. We could have had a conversation about how to present the shareholder history clearly and fairly at any point in the last 2 years. I didn't initiate that conversation and neither did you. Silence. What do you want? She said. Not hostile. Exhausted. I want the IPO prospectus to accurately reflect the ownership structure of the company, I said. I want my role in the founding architecture to be accurately described. I don't want to block the offering, Priya. I never wanted to block the offering. I want it to be accurate. The underwriters are talking about pausing the offering. A week minimum. Maybe more. Do you understand what that does to the timeline? To investor confidence. I understand it very well, I said. I'm a managing director at a PE firm that has evaluated 47 IPOs in the last 6 years. I understand exactly what a disclosure complication does to a timeline. Another silence. Longer. Why? She said. After all this time, you could have told them the same thing a year ago. A year ago you weren't about to list a company with an inaccurate ownership presentation in the prospectus, I said. The legal obligation didn't exist a year ago. It exists now. That's not the only reason. I was quiet for a moment. Because she was right. It wasn't the only reason. And Priya, for all her faults, had always been able to identify the real current underneath the conversation. No, I said. It's not the only reason. She waited. Derek told Garrett Ashby I was painful to watch discuss business, I said. At a dinner full of investors who were about to evaluate a company I own 67% of. While you stood up and gave a toast about everything you built. I built half of it, Priya. The half that made the enterprise tier possible. And I sat at the far end of the table and smiled and adjusted my napkin and said nothing. Silence. I don't want a different percentage, I said. I don't want a title or credit in the press release or anything else. I want the prospectus to be accurate. I want the people who are about to make investment decisions based on this company's story to know what the actual story is. That's all. I could hear her breathing. That's going to be a hard conversation, she said. With the investors. Yes, I said. I imagine it will be. Will you be there for it? If I set up the meeting? I considered this. Yes, I said. I'll be there. The investor disclosure meeting was held 10 days later, in a conference room at Harwick N. Lane's Chicago office. 11 investors: Priya, her lawyers, her CFO Brenda Walsh, James, and me. I want to describe Priya at that meeting because she is not a villain in this story, even if she behaved badly in it. She sat at the head of the table with the posture of someone who has made a decision to face a thing fully rather than survive it sideways. And she presented the complete shareholder history with clarity and without deflection. She described my role in the founding architecture accurately. She said specifically, Rhea solved a structural problem that made the enterprise product possible. Her equity position reflects that. I should have been clearer about this in earlier communications, and I wasn't. It was not enough. But it was true, and she said it with the composure of someone who had decided that truth was what the moment required. And I respected that, in the complicated way I had come to respect Priya, with full awareness of everything it existed alongside. Garrett Ashby asked me 3 technical questions about the platform architecture. I answered them without notes, precisely in the manner that Adiz had described as communicating in financial models. He nodded slowly after the third answer with the expression of someone revising an estimate significantly upward. The offering was delayed by 9 days. It was not cancelled. With the accurate prospectus with the full shareholder picture disclosed, the institutional investor community received the information and largely incorporated it into their analysis without the catastrophic confidence collapse Priya had feared. The IPO launched. It performed modestly, not the explosive first-day pop Priya had projected, but a stable, legitimate opening that reflected the company's actual value rather than a constructed narrative. I sold 12% of my position on the open market over the following 6 months. The remainder I held. At no point did Priya and I discuss what happens next between us. The relationship sat in a kind of suspended state, not broken, not repaired, not fully acknowledged. We were connected through a company and through blood and through the specific history of 2 women who had needed each other at a particular moment and handled that need imperfectly in different directions. My mother called me in April after the IPO had settled. She had heard about it through the family. The family always heard about things eventually, through the elaborate telephone network of Indian aunts that made formal intelligence services look inefficient. Sunita called me, she said. My aunt. Priya's mother. She's upset. I imagine, I said. She said you tried to destroy Priya's company. The IPO launched, I said. The company is public. Priya is the CEO of a publicly listed health technology company. I don't think that qualifies as destruction. My mother was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was assembling the right words. My mother was a chemistry teacher's wife who had spent 30 years watching her sister build something and had felt the particular complicated emotion of loving someone whose success also measures you against itself. She understood more about this than she usually said. She should have told the truth from the beginning, my mother said finally. About your role. About what you did. Yes, I said. You should have said something sooner. Yes, I said. Probably. So you're both wrong. That's about right, I said. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. You're so much like your father, she said. He never pushed back either. He just waited until the thing couldn't be ignored. I thought about the Venus flytrap. One touch isn't enough. Is that a criticism? I asked. I don't know, she said. I'm still deciding. I appreciated her honesty. It was a family trait, the honesty, even when everything around it was complicated. There is something I need to tell you about Derek. In June, 2 months after the IPO, Priya and Derek separated. I do not say this as a consequence or a punishment. It had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the years of small erosions in a marriage that had been under professional pressure for a long time. Priya told me this herself on a phone call that was the first genuinely personal conversation we'd had since the disclosure meeting. He said I changed, she said. After the IPO. After the meeting. Did you? I don't know. Maybe I stopped performing a version of myself that needed him to agree with everything. I thought about this. That's not a small change, I said. No, she said. It's not. We talked for an hour. It was the longest we had talked about real things since 2018 when she had come to me with a problem she couldn't solve and I had solved it and she had paid me in equity and we had each privately filed the other away under a category that was easier to manage than the truth of what we actually were to each other, which was, I think, more similar than either of us had been willing to admit. Two women from the same family with different advantages and different deficits, who had each built something real and had each, at various points, handled the other person badly. I did not tell her I was sorry for the timing of the disclosure. I was not sure I was. But I told her the company was good and that the platform architecture we had built together was worth taking public, and that I had never wanted to take anything from her, only to be accurately accounted for, and she was quiet for a long time after I said that. I know, she said. I knew that, and I told myself a different story anyway. It was easier. I know, I said. We didn't resolve it. There isn't a resolution exactly. There is a company we both have ownership stakes in, her 29%, my remaining 55%, the rest distributed among investors. And there is a shared history that is more complicated than either of us wanted it to be. And there is the ongoing question of what we make of each other now that the false story has been replaced by the true one. Adiz and I went for a run in Central Park on a Saturday in May. It was the kind of morning that makes New York feel like a gift rather than a sentence. Bright, mild, the park in early bloom. Adiz ran faster than me by a meaningful margin and had the good grace to slow down without being asked. How do you feel about it now? She said. The whole thing. Complicated, I said. Specifically. Like I did the right thing and I also did it partly for the wrong reasons, I said. And the outcome is correct and the process was messy and Priya and I might actually be able to be something to each other now that wasn't possible before. And Derek said I was painful to watch and he was wrong about that, but it still landed. It lands because you let it land, Adiz said. That's not a flaw. That's just being a person. I ran for a while without speaking. The park moved past us. Joggers, strollers, a man with 3 dogs who seemed to be having an excellent time. She called me the week after the IPO, I said. Priya. Not about business. Just to talk. That means something, Adiz said. It means something, I agreed. I'm not sure what yet. The most honest answer possible, she said, and she picked up her pace slightly and I matched it, and we ran in the clean May morning through the park that was full of things blooming whether or not anyone was watching. Here's what I know. I know that I built something real in 2018 and that it was used without full acknowledgement and that I waited longer than I should have to require the truth to be told, and that the waiting was partly strategy and partly conflict avoidance and partly the specific tiredness that comes from being at the far end of tables your whole life and deciding, again and again, that this is not the moment to make a thing of it. I know that the IPO launched and the company is public and the architecture I designed is at the center of a platform that 340 hospital systems now use to analyze patient data, and that this is worth something independent of whether anyone at a dinner table in Chicago acknowledges it. I know that Zara is 7 and is deeply invested in the question of how carnivorous plants make decisions, and that she will be 8 in August and wants a cake that is shaped like a sundew, which I have already commissioned from a bakery in Williamsburg that seemed, improbably, not at all surprised by this request. I know that what you build when no one is watching is more durable than what you build for an audience. I know that silence is not the same as absence. I know that the difference between a weapon and a tool is sometimes only the hand that holds it. And I know that somewhere in Chicago, a woman who is genuinely good at holding rooms is sitting with the full truth of her company's story for the first time, and that this is uncomfortable and also, I believe, a relief. I didn't want to collapse her IPO. I wanted the truth to be accurate. In the end, both things happened and neither one is the end of the story because the end of the story hasn't arrived yet and may not for a long time, and I have made my peace with living in the middle of things. The middle is where the real work is. It always was.